I'm Alex Halliday, and welcome to our Earth Day presentation of the Columbia Climate School's Earth Series. The climate crisis, as we all know, is all-encompassing and involves every part of society. One can think of many major systems that need to change in a manner that builds resilience to the effects of climate change while also reducing emissions. These need to transition in a fashion that is equitable and elevates the well-being of people. The major systems that need to change are things like energy, land use, food, transportation. One other major system that needs to change is our cities. We need to understand how we transition from where the urban environment is today to what we need for the future. Climate change is altering the world, bringing excessive heat, more extreme weather events, sustained droughts, devastating wildfires, and rising sea levels. These dynamics are forcing change and endangering populations. And these realities have given way to new technologies, innovative ways of protecting humanity, and allowing us to create a sustainable future. And this is really urgently needed. In its latest report, the UN's climate science team, the IPCC, underscored the urgency of a paradigm shift in the way we think about climate change, a time to tap into ingenuity and novel solutions like never before. Tonight, I'm joined by two of Columbia University's superstars, visionary experts who have been working on reinventing approaches to where and how we live in our cities and our communities. Amale Andraos is a design researcher, author, and professor who has just stepped down after many years serving as Dean of Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. At Columbia, she now serves as an advisor to the president on the university's climate initiatives and the climate school. She is recognized as an architecture thought leader and has lectured and taught widely. Amale is the co-founder of the award-winning New York City architecture firm WorkAC with her partner, Dan Wood. Their work includes such notable projects as Public Farm No. 1 at MoMA, PS1, the Edible Schoolyard at PS216, PS, for those of you who don't know, is public school, in Brooklyn, and PS7 in Harlem, the Miami Garage Museum, and the Beirut Museum of Art as well, currently under construction, as well as many other celebrated spaces. Her publications include The Arab City, Architecture and Representation, co-edited with Nora Akawi. We'll get there when we cross that bridge, 49 cities, and Above the Pavement, the Farm, in collaboration with her partner, Dan Wood. Her impact on architectural practice around the world was recognized when she was named Honorary Fellow of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada in 2021. Andrew Smyth is a smart cities expert, and Columbia's Robert A. W. and Christian S. Carlton Professor of Civil Engineering. Andrew specializes in structural health monitoring, using sensor information to determine the condition of critical infrastructure. Recently, his interest in sensor network monitoring has expanded to large fleets of vehicles in urban environments, and we'll hear about that a bit tonight. This sensor instrumentation and vibration analysis has included the remote monitoring of several iconic long-span bridges and landmark buildings and museums. His research interests include the development of data fusion and system identification algorithms to derive maximum information from large heterogeneous sensor networks, monitoring dynamical systems. He also does nonlinear system dynamical modeling and simulation and natural hazards risk assessment. So you're supposed to be impressed by all of that. It's a pretty amazing couple of people we've got here today. So welcome to you both, and thanks for being here. So I'm going to turn to Amale first. Amale, let's just kick off with how you got into the subject. Architecture is foundational to your work, clearly. And you are known for exploring the built environment in a way that seeks to balance urbanization with sustainability. So can you tell us what led you to your fascinating work?
Thank you, Alex. It's really a pleasure to be here with you tonight, and especially on the Earth Day. And I'm very hopeful that this is about hope, as you list all of the overwhelming things we need to address. So my partner Dan and I were invited to teach at Princeton a seminar on urbanism in 2003. We had just come back from the Netherlands, where things are done quite differently. And we were very interested already in the notion of ecology and urbanism. We were working in Panama and Costa Rica and countries that were trying to bridge the two in quite a progressive way. And so we started this eco-urbanism seminar and got our students to research cities. And slowly we realized, we've had technology for a long time, but where are the ideas? And we kind of started to look back historically at visionary cities, utopian cities, moments where architects kind of dreamt of, different ways of living. And so we researched about 200 of these historical visionary cities and chose 49 of them to look at them through a kind of ecological lens, like literally redrawing them, measuring them, understanding where those cities were planning to get their food from, water systems, different shades of green, parks, forests, etc. And what was interesting in the book, it's a sort of guide to city making, if you like, is that on the left-hand side, it was kind of an ingredient, like what you get in your cereal box. What does it take to, density, FAR, green space to build space, etc. But on the right-hand side, the cities were drawn
together physics-based modeling together with large sensor network modeling in order to understand our infrastructure. And, this field, we call it structural health monitoring. And in much the same way that we're aging, our infrastructure ages and deteriorates. And it's wise to go for periodic checkups to identify deficiencies before they become critical and emergent. So obviously New York is a great place for me to do this kind of work, because we have, at least by US standards, older infrastructure, which has been exposed to relatively harsh climates. And those loads that our infrastructure is exposed to have been increasing over time, just with increasing population density. And oftentimes our infrastructure has outlived its original design life. And so then when you superimpose on top of that the effects of climate change with more frequent extreme events, we've got plenty to do, I would say, in terms of risk management and mitigation. So fundamentally, for me, the experience of instrumenting our infrastructure to gain insights and knowledge into performance has broadened my research into other sectors of infrastructure and made me realize there's so much that we can do to create more resilient, efficient, and livable cities. And obviously, the arrival of the Internet of Things has opened up that potential to really understand our urban environment at high resolutions of space and time. And so this whole host of things that can be sensed in cities, I think affords us the potential for a better understanding of cities and its inhabitants to promote resilience, sustainability, efficiency, and livability for all.
Yeah. So that's a great start from both of you. Thank you. And of course, the Internet of Things opens up all kinds of ethical issues as well and privacy issues. So these are big issues for us going forward anyway, regardless of climate change. How do we change society? Amale, okay, focusing on climate change, it's altering the world we live in, and of course, so the built environment, the urban landscape. How do you actually reconsider this? Thinking of as we said at the beginning, this cities system that has to change going forward to be able to be both to decarbonize, but also to be resilient to future climate change. What are your overarching ideas for reinventing the cities going forward?
Well, there's kind of two parts, I think, to this question. Well, there's many parts, but there are the basic things that we need to do that we sort of know how to do, some of it better than others. If I think through across scale, I tend to kind of think through scale when I think about the built environment. You know, at the material scale, we need to get a handle on embodied energy. You know, how much does it take to produce concrete or steel, or, you know, that scale of the material is crucial, because most buildings are still built out of concrete and steel. And if you look at the regions of the world that are, you know, urbanizing now and going to continue to urbanize, they are really using these materials. So there's a kind of sense of urgency, and, you know, not everyone has access to timber. You know, in Europe, in America, we're sort of celebrating timber. I just got back from Beirut, Lebanon. I can tell you the cedars are gone. So we don't have timber to use. And so we really need to think about the material scale. And there's a lot of research. There's in fact research at Columbia University on replacing and reinventing, you know, concrete, which is quite exciting. At the building scale, we understand operating energy today. I think we really understand how we can minimize heating and cooling and kind of, you know, build an envelope that is high performance. But we need better regulation, you know, across cities and across the planet. And these regulations are quite, you know, varied. So these are policy questions more than design questions. I think on the design question, we know how to do it. At the urban scale, you know, I think, you know, what makes an equitable city is going to make a more resilient city. So we need better access to housing. We need better access to public transportation, walkable city. You know, you can't speak of density without speaking of affordable and equitable housing for everyone, without speaking of access to, you know, healthy food for everyone, healthy, you know, water, etc. Because sprawl is in fact, you know, one of the driver of carbon emissions when you think about the built environment. So if we want to re-densify, we need to make sure that everyone that is living in this dense kind of environment is, you know, has access to, you know, equitable living sort of conditions. And we saw that, you know, with COVID or with Sandy in New York, with any recent or not so recent crisis, it's always the most vulnerable population, often communities of color, who are most affected. So we really need to learn from that. But you use the word reinvent. And so the second part of the question is the, you know, as an architect, the kind of opportunities to reimagine that are exciting to me. If I, you know, visualize a kind of typical city now, I want to reinvent every surface, you know, rooftops becoming, you know, farms, urban farms. You know, if most cars are going to be automated, surely some of these streets are, you know, going to be able to be used for something else. Can we grow plants? Can we be living, you know, in kind of more forest-like environments? I mean, we saw with COVID in New York, restaurants taking over the street, and suddenly pedestrian life was back. Glass is very performing today, but is it really you know, providing new opportunities to negotiate between inside and outside, to create different experiences in these vertical surfaces? And, you know, Andrew mentioned infrastructure. You know, when I think of infrastructure, is there a way to reinvent it to create new kind of public experiences, new kind of collective moments in the city that are surprising, something more than just moving things? Like, can you do something more with it? So I think there's just a lot to reinvent, in the end, I think modernism, let's say, and industrialization and zoning and these things that we needed to do when work was dirty and manufacture, you know, it kind of split things apart. You know, we tend to still say this happens here, this happens here. I think we have to reimagine the urban, the rural, and the natural sort of in a more messy hybrid way, even within the context of our cities. And I think the result will be, you know, it's a different way to conceive of urbanity. You know, maybe we should be designing shelters for species, you know, that are sort of could live in our environment. So that's the part that excites me as well in terms of the reinvention part.
That's great, fantastic. So by species, you mean animals as well as plants, and that sounds great. I like messy. It sounds really good. So. So Andrew, over to you. I mean, one of the great things about the climate school is that we realized that there was so much going on at Columbia across different schools already, and your school of engineering and applied sciences has been trailblazing in so many exciting ways. Tell us about how, in the area of climate and sustainability, tell us about your more than 20-year career at Columbia. how has climate change really impacted your research and that of your colleagues in the school?
So as I mentioned, my original background is in structural engineering primarily. And so the climate change has touched my research in many, many ways. So as a structural engineer, the dominant force from nature that we worry about most is gravity. And so in my lifetime, I hope that does not change. But on top of that, as I mentioned, is the superposition of climate effects and increasing extreme weather events. And so I've had a few experiences over the years where that power of nature has really struck me with a considerable awe. So I've been part of some post-disaster reconnaissance teams in New Orleans, lower Ninth Ward after Hurricane Katrina, in central Taiwan in 2004, the mudslide ravaged communities there. So advising on reconstruction and land use. In 2011, with a few hours notice, rushed out to Verrazano Narrows Bridge to instrument the bridge because there was interest in Hurricane Irene's effects. It was projected to have high wind speeds across the bridge, which could potentially, give us a lot of information on its performance. And then most recently working together with our now provost, but then Dean Mary Boyce, reviewing the rehabilitation of the L train tunnel with our former governor, and obviously that was
those of you who are not New Yorkers. Can you explain what the L train is, Andrew?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So during Hurricane Sandy, the L train, so this is a tunnel underneath the East River, was inundated, as was so much of Lower Manhattan's subway system. And that caused extreme damage to the electrical system, control systems, and required extensive rehabilitation, which was going to lead to probably a year and a half or more shutdown for all commuters across that subway link. And I think affecting over 250,000 daily trips across that link. And so we were called in as an advisory team to help rethink the rehabilitation of that, and we managed to propose some suggestions which sort of obviated the need for a shutdown. They were able to do things in a more creative way. But built into that solution is actually a permanent monitoring system. So for the future that we can keep an eye on it. So as I said, all of those experiences have really taught me the importance of engineering and anticipating our increasing hazards. But also, and I think this is really, really important, is connecting the knowledge. Many things we understand and can already estimate and project as engineers working together with climate scientists, but transferring that to policy action is really an extra challenge. And that's sort of the resiliency side of the story. I fundamentally, though, also see the infrastructure monitoring thrust as being about sustainability. So managing infrastructure responsibly so that it doesn't have failures, from which one has to have an entire rebuild. So rebuilding infrastructure from scratch is extremely capital intensive, obviously disruptive, and it's very impactful for cities. And as Amale mentioned already, building materials themselves are extremely energy intensive. So concrete, or the cement industry, if it was a country, it would be the third highest greenhouse gas emitting country in the world after China and the US. And so, as Amale mentioned, I have colleagues in civil and environmental engineering working on tackling exactly that challenge. So reducing the CO2 emissions that goes into the creation of Portland cement, either using upcycling or even other materials for that Portland cement binder. And obviously steel production is also extremely energy intensive. So we have a lot to do on the material side as well.
So what do you see as the biggest challenges, Andrew, in terms of, if you had to really get something sorted quickly?
Amale really captured, I think, most of them. Obviously, there's increasing urban populations. That's a global phenomenon, obviously in the United States as well. complexity that goes with that densification, that can lead to sort of unforeseen failures. Most large cities are coastal. So there are going to be a lot of land use issues, very, very challenging land use questions, obviously legal consequences of that. I've mentioned aging infrastructure already in our older, more developed cities. And I think an important one, and Amal pointed to this too, that there's sort of the social equity piece, that the kind of paradox, I would say, of a successful city is that they attract people. That's a good thing, and I definitely think that's part of the solution of toward a more sustainable planet. But immediately accompanying that is the fact that affordable housing then becomes a huge issue, and so it's no longer successful for all. So that is something that we need to sort of directly address, and it's going to be through public funding usually.
All right. Amal, when we talk about adapting to climate change, we typically focus on technological innovation and what can we do. But judging by what you said earlier, I just wanted you to expand on this idea that we might want to think about this differently from the perspective of past practices and ways of life. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. Just picking some models, historical and other, that I think were interesting for us to think about in my practice and in my research. You know, when we did 49 cities, it was interesting to note that Le Corbusier, the very famous modernist architect, came up with this radiant city idea. And usually it's criticized because it's tower in the park. But actually, when you look at what he was proposing an extremely dense kind of city that where buildings had a minimal footprint, and the ground was really like a forest. It was, there were kind of game grounds, there were urban farms, it was much richer than what was left when you look now at public housing, or which is kind of concrete. So, and so this for us is still, it's still important to think about the ground as something much thicker, much richer, and to bring it together with density and to rethink this model. You know, other models that I love to think about historically that are tied to infrastructure, thinking about Andrews, when Haussmann in Paris carved his big kind of boulevards this was the era of infrastructure in the 1850s. Every neighborhood had they call it a lavoir. It was a public place for washing, and women would gather there to wash. And it really kind of started seeds of conversations and social movements and women's movements. And so how do we think about infrastructure to create opportunities for coming together?
Yeah.
I love earthships. You know, they're really ugly, but the earthship idea in Arizona, which is this individual house that is built in the desert, that is like a little system that, uses minimal energy. And, there are ambitions such as those that are reimagining each part of the built environment that I think are still quite inspiring to me as an architect, and that I think about when I think about kind of living in a new way.
So that's absolutely amazing. And so you're getting me very, because I do feel, we do need to figure out what things need to look like 10, 30, but actually 100 years from now, as we gradually decarbonize and actually decarbonize as fast as possible the society. And so this opportunity to think completely differently about cities, I think is wonderful. And we'll come back to some of the issues of COVID later on. I wanted to ask you about, and whether that's changed the way cities might work in the future. But Andrew, over to you. Do you actually see a place in the future for the kind of old ways that Amal describes? I mean, they sound wonderful, and the whole thing of serendipitous interaction and creating a community, which I must admit, even when I walk around New York, I'm amazed, given how the place is built. You find people bumping into each other and chatting on the street. I just think they clearly belong to a community that's been around for a while, and they actually, and it's almost like there are villages all over New York that are actually coming together. Are there ways in which you think smart cities can approach work in concert with these ideas? And and help address the urgent need for rapid deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions, but also create an environment that is different and what we need for the future?
I mean, fundamentally, yes. So I don't see smart cities and maybe older ways of doing things as competing. They can be entirely complementary. I would say just immediately that the cities that we have, it will take some time to change them. But there's so much capital has gone into them. We're doing even a poor job of maintaining just basic functionality of the infrastructure that we have. So there would really have to be a massive change in public appetite. I think, and I mentioned this before, my fundamental view on this, I didn't come to this area from a climate point of view. I guess perhaps I just love cities and I love living in them. But I think it's very, very clear that cities are a key part of the solution for a more sustainable planet. There have been many studies that have shown that drastically lower carbon footprint per capita for urban dwellers, particularly in high density. If you compare, let's say, US cities versus large cities versus smaller urban agglomerations in the US. And that's the same, by the way, not just for individual households and dwellers, but also for all of the services that go to support that. And so I think that's a key thing. So from my point of view, the climate is a huge benefit that I want to promote, but it's a byproduct of saying, if we can make cities more attractive, more livable, then we will get this knock-on benefit. We should also make urban life greener, but most importantly, I think we should promote cities. I mean, just to give you an idea, the difference in CO2 footprint per capita, it can be like factors of 20. I've seen it in some studies between places like New York. We are one of the very best in the United States versus other smaller cities across the country. So these are huge impacts. And so that obviously that's coming from transportation. Living in apartments in general is much more energy efficient than living in single family homes and all of the energy uses that comes with that. So I guess what I'm saying is just promoting cities, making them function better, making them more attractive, more livable, is in and of itself a huge step in the right direction. And to me, because we're sort of stuck with the infrastructure that we have, the fastest way to adapt to a lot of the challenges and to make cities greener is actually through some technological interventions. And so I'm not at all saying that technologies can be the solution and the savior for everything, but if they're injected in a thoughtful, ethical manner, then yes, they can definitely help. So I think of this as sort of adding like a digital layer to our infrastructure, and think of the analogy could be like software and hardware on our computers. So it can be easier to update the software or firmware, but maybe more expensive and something one doesn't do very often that one updates one's computer. Maybe that's not a great analogy, but that might be a simple way to think of what I'm thinking about. And so for us, as I mentioned before, in New York City is an incredible place to work. So it's for me and the people that I work with, it's sort of our living lab. And even more than that, we've just recently, just adjacent to Columbia's campus, we have in West Harlem or an experimental testbed, and this is in advanced urban wireless communications. And also connected to that is localized, what we call edge computing, that can provide sort of the infrastructure, the digital infrastructure to kind of pilot some of the ideas that we're looking to pursue. So this is roughly a 30-block test bed and can support all kinds of pilot testing. So the type of thing that you would need if you wanted autonomous vehicles to function safely in urban environments, if you wanted to improve city services through, like garbage collection, pest control, roadside construction, facade inspection, all sorts of, the nitty-gritty of the day-to-day, those kinds of things could be made to function more seamlessly. Deliveries, urban freight, that's just a huge hassle and safety concern in cities. Traffic safety, safer streets for vulnerable populations, and then a lot of applications in hyperlocal environmental sensing. So heat island effects, air quality, urban flooding, and I'm sure things that we can't even dream of yet, but to explore what could we do to make our fixed infrastructure more adaptive in the short time horizon, just because things are changing so fast. But I underscore that technology can be exciting, but fundamentally, I believe it needs to serve the social and ecological needs. So we should not be serving technology.
Okay, that sounds like a good good line. Amal, I mean, building on this idea Andrew's put out, that cities can be a powerful solution to the problems of climate change. And of course, in New York, we've got this advantage of this thing called the subway, which is an amazing, which actually means we don't need to do a lot of other things that other people do with cars, etc. Still seem to be a lot of cars in New York, of course, but so what are your thoughts about his idea, his thesis, that cities can be a powerful solution to the need to alter energy use in particular?
Yeah, of course, I totally agree. I think density is better, lesser footprint is better. What I would say though is, what I love about what Andrew is describing now is not just let's do a brand new city somewhere in the desert and all the bells and whistles of technology to celebrate technology. He's talking about adaptive reuse at the, an adaptation at the scale of an existing infrastructure. And that is also in itself a great step towards sustainability, reusing what we have and making it smarter, better, through this other layer. We talked about messiness. We want to be layering these things, green stuff, technological stuff. I think this is really interesting and important to be able to reuse and not just give up and kind of go somewhere else. The only thing that I always sort of struggle with, and maybe that's a result of our 49 cities, is you never want to look at a strict boundary. You want to understand things as porous. The city is not this isolated little island that performs really well. As urban dwellers, we are, queens of extraction. I mean, food is coming miles away to serve us, materials, and so we almost need to trace, take every urban dweller and make connections and understand, where's all the stuff coming from, and can we fold it back closer, or can we be smarter about these networks so that we don't just have, like stuff serving cities and just land serving cities, around, and you don't create this dichotomy between the urban and the rural, which honestly has become a political dichotomy around the world, and real inequities are, visible through that kind of division as well. So we need to look at things kind of holistically and almost as networks, and never think of the city as this kind of isolated object. It's always connected. And how do we make those connections better, more equitable? I think those are the kinds of questions. But ultimately, yes, we should be trying to densify and trying to do more with this amazing thing that has been with us for centuries, which is this kind of living close knit together, in a dense settlement.
Is it the same in places like Nairobi as it is in New York, or do you think there's
no? So I think that's the other thing, is like, there is a difference between an urban dweller in New York and an urban dweller in Nairobi. We don't have the same carbon footprint. We don't even have the same carbon footprint in different neighborhoods in New York. I mean, we have to recognize that ultimately climate change is, much more, those of us in the wealthy, wealth has a direct impact on carbon footprint, and that is a real issue. And this is why the notion of equity and social justice is intimately connected to climate change. In the end, it is the most vulnerable. It is the country, many countries in the global south who have not contributed historically to carbon emissions and climate change, who are going to carry the burden of this. So at every scale, this issue of equity is crucial. So it's not a homogeneous map. And so cities are not, not equal in that sense.
So let's talk about the pandemic and the effects, that funny last 2 years. So, and maybe not over yet. So what are the lessons we can learn from this? And also have cities and the culture of work and offices changed permanently? I'm interested in both these issues because I think someone was actually saying the other day, I was at an event at the New York Historical Society, and one of our donors, actually, Barbara Lee Diamondstein Spielvogel, who is given us the first money for scholarships for the climate school. It's fantastic. Anyway, she raised this whole issue. She's well and truly part of New York. And she just wondered what's going to be the future of these parts of New York where people have been in offices and maybe they won't want to be in offices in the future. And are these bits going to become sort of repurposed in some way? What are we going to do with all this office infrastructure? I've had other people just saying the same thing to me in London, in charge of huge huge buildings that are incredibly spectacular, and they don't know whether really they're going to need that much space any longer. So what are your thoughts about that? Andrew, do you want to kick off on that?
Sure. I mean, obviously from an environmental point of view, there's less commuting as a result of that. So that has environmental benefits. But as you just pointed out, Alex, there seem to be an awful lot of cars in New York City. And in fact, vehicle registration is up. And probably is harder to find a parking space now. So that part of it, where we think we would have gotten a benefit, in fact, behaviors through this strange impulse have led to odd outcomes. Obviously, I think the increase in micromobility, scooters, e-bikes, bicycles, all of that part has been a fantastic positive change in sort of urban life, urban culture. The downside, though, immediately then has been the clear increase in pedestrian, cyclists, fatalities and injuries. And so while we were doing really well for a long time, we think programs like Vision Zero, there was an improvement, maybe it had kind of stabilized, but there were some positive outcomes from the COVID pandemic, but then always sort of muted by other things. I think the explosion of sort of e-commerce deliveries, that was something which, I mean, it was already picking up, but that exploded obviously during the pandemic. And I think maybe has become really ingrained in culture, in urban culture now. This is getting maybe off topic from a technical point of view, but I do worry a lot about the sort of bifurcation of work roles in sort of those that are served and those that are serving, in that I think that's going to be problematic in the near term even. And this gets to at least what I think of, for cities to work, they have to work equitably. So the social justice component is really important, and I want cities to work. So those are some, I guess, initial thoughts. I think it has presented a lot of challenges. There's been a tremendous amount of innovation. As I said, the delivery networks, there's been a lot of rapid innovation. I think we've questioned the way public spaces are used. I think that's a great thing. So who is the city serving? So I think we sort of need to sift through the pros and cons of these and figure out how to integrate the pros into our future cities. But I don't have all the answers. But you were mentioning about the subway ridership and how that's such a great thing that we have. I was looking the other day at ridership data and how that's coming back versus pre-pandemic levels. And it's quite interesting to note that the Saturday ridership is the one that's closest. It's almost like 80% or something like that of pre-pandemic levels, whereas weekday is, in the mid 50s to 60s. And I think that really signifies that connectedness, that socialization, culture, the activities that one might engage in on a Saturday are still going to be a real draw in cities. And I think that's kind of the magnetic force that is going to sort of keep cities alive and kicking for a long time. I don't think, I think this is a transient blip, I guess, fundamentally.
Okay, so we're going to run it. We've got nearly 500 people here, and there's a lot of questions about to come in. So I wanted to switch to Q&A in a minute, but just before for that, Amal, maybe just one for you, just quickly. What do you tell me about what worries you most, and also what you are most hopeful about in terms of what inspires you most about this issue of climate and the future of cities?
I mean, every day I wake up, I think about it. It's a really overwhelming, so that's, and as Andrew pointed to COVID as the most recent crisis, you know, some things we did really well, some things we just could not get momentum on, you know, not even, I mean, we developed vaccines in like speed, light, you know, and then half the people don't want to, you know, I mean, it's like, this is where, you know, and it's going to be the same with, it is the same with the climate crisis. But on the other hand, you know, I think everyday little transformations, I mean, just to tell a little personal story, my kids around the time of COVID, they just stopped eating red meat, and, you know, they're 9 and 12. We rarely ate red meat beforehand, but it's just a thing. And I think our students, our kids are, you know, the awareness is so ingrained now that I think there's a lot of behavioral change. And if you look at the capacity to change one's behavior under COVID, we can change. And I think it's possible to change to address the climate crisis, and we have to do it. So this is maybe the more hopeful side is our capacity to adapt.
Okay. So I'm going to switch. I know there's many more questions I was going to ask you, but we're going to need to switch to the panel, to the audience now, because there's a ton of questions coming in. And I just want to kick off, and I might, if we can maybe answer them fairly quickly so that we can get through more questions, if that's okay. So I'll ask Andrew this one, and I probably won't ask you both the same questions, but Andrew, what are the top 3 initiatives, or maybe 1 or 2, whatever, that smart cities can do to mitigate against climate change? What do you think are the most important things?
Okay, probably things around the grid in terms of power storage, like dynamic bidirectional power storage coupled with EVs. Autonomous vehicles, they're hyped for probably maybe the wrong reasons, but they could have a lot of benefits to more efficient transportation. Even sprinkling a few autonomous vehicles into a mixed bag with human driven vehicles can improve the behavior of the collective and make it more efficient. And as I mentioned before, just infrastructure resilience, understanding, it's really the science, the exposure, where are we now? That is just a really important aspect of sort of the sensing piece.
And I guess building materials are going to need to change quite dramatically. You know, bearing in mind what you said about concrete and steel. Do you think there are ways of doing this? Amal, maybe you should answer this one. Are there ways to actually mitigate climate change by changing to wood, or do you think that's just so fanciful for New York?
No, I don't think anything is fanciful. First of all, you know, first thing is, if you have an existing fabric, adaptive reuse, preservation, this is what we need to be doing more and more everywhere. Yeah. Second, if you have, you know, the timber technology is advancing, certainly in places like Europe and the US, this is definitely a choice. In other places, you know, research in diminishing or transforming concrete. We have faculty at Columbia looking at earthen materials, and so alternate materials, definitely we need to be looking at those too. I think it's very specific, it's almost becomes more regional, whereas in a way with modernism and this sort of, you know, everything became a kind of homogeneous go-to concrete and steel. Yeah. So we have to go back to what is possible more regionally.
So another question for you, Amal, maybe, although feel free to dive in, Andrew. What are the limits to growth in terms of population? I mean, is there a calculation for such a thing as an optimal size of a city?
this is why the boundary around city is very abstract. There is no boundary anymore. So like a city is like this, and it never ends. So
you're saying it should be like this, right? You want to bring
it should, but I don't know if that's possible. Ebenezer Howard, who came up with the town country, which was the origin of the suburban model, had these circular cities, and after a certain size, you would create a new circle, and everything in between was, and so it was kind of anti-sprawl, and it was. But I think I don't know how to answer this. I think. A density that can maintain and support equity and all the characteristics we identified in terms of transportation, walkability, housing, access to healthy food. I don't know if it's a number per se. Density could be continuous as long as within every neighborhood you get the ingredients that you need.
Andrew, have you got an answer for that one or not really?
I don't have an answer, but I think it's an opportunity, and I think this is where I'm not an urban theorist, but I think this is it's an optimization problem is what you're posing, and I think this is where engineers could work together with Amale and others, to come up at least with the idea of what is some kind of optimal, not just in a purely engineering sense, but something that makes sense both from an engineering sense and from a social point of view.
Okay, so I'm going to go back. There's a lot of interesting questions coming in. So in an increasingly warming world, why do we continue to build upward with steel and glass, which requires air conditioning to maintain comfortable temperatures? Why aren't architects creating buildings that go down into the earth with light wells, of course, in order to take advantage of the natural insulation of earth and soil, which of course happened in ancient times, as we know in the Middle East. So Amale, you should tackle this one, I think.
We can. It's very expensive to go down. There's the water table. There's all kinds of issues, and we are creatures of light and air. And bringing those things down are also really difficult. But I think that's why I was mentioning the earth ship. There are ideas about integrating a little bit more in that section, but I would say the problem is not going from very high up to very high down, but maybe thickening the crust to be building something that is demands slightly less energy in terms of being able to be walkable, etc.
Okay, so Andrew, what one for you here? So if you could think about the way we are now thinking about creating green buildings. Maybe this is for both of you actually. Are there some ways in which one could actually start to think about the built environment in terms of buildings that offset their carbon emissions, one relative to the other? So you can have a green building that actually is carbon negative, and another one that's carbon positive alongside each other. Are people thinking in those terms, in terms of how they think about the infrastructure needed for the cities to get towards net zero?
Yeah, I think the most likely way of achieving that kind of thing is primarily through sort of solar panel skins on our buildings. That won't work everywhere, obviously, and depending upon the proximity of neighboring, if it's a tall building, there could be shade cast. But I think that would be probably, you need efficient heating and cooling, so probably geothermal or something like that. But in terms of generation of power, it would probably be through solar.
Okay, and another question here, maybe this is for you, Amale. Given that over the next 20 years, lower income countries will develop their cities, how do the panelists see the adoption of their ideas where financial resources are somewhat limited?
I think many of the ideas we talked about tonight are ideas about thinking about the use of materials that are regional and that are sort of moving away from heavy carbon use. And I think for developing countries and countries of the global south, that's difficult. Concrete has become the go-to material. I mean, I was just in Beirut, Lebanon 2 weeks ago, and concrete is everything. So I understand that the transformation there is really crucial. Density and access to housing and all these things, I mean, these are not specific to what we need to do here in the global north. And in many ways right now, so it's not. I think these ingredients are ingredients that that's why I was saying it's not just about data and technology and resources, it's also about the design of the city and its parts in terms of its form, its proximity, its scale, and these kinds of relationship between inside and outside.
So, I mean, as the populations grow, which is great because people are living longer and we're sort of eliminating disease and standards of living are generally increasing in many parts of the world. Cities are going to grow, and there's no question about that. But there's also the issue of food security that is associated with all of this. And one of the questions here is, any thoughts on vertical and indoor farming in city spaces going forward? Because farming has got its own carbon footprint issues. And so how do you actually build this into the design of a city where most of the people are going to be living and they're going to need food?
Yeah, maybe I can answer that. Or is it for Andrew? Andrew, you want to?
No. You should take this one.
We've been working with the vertical farming quite a bit, with urban farming, etc. I think definitely you're going to have a component in cities. They're very energy intensive right now, and the only way to do it is with kind of carbon offsets, etc. But large companies, there was just an article recently in the New York Times about companies like Walmart and other who are looking into trying to grow food through indoor farming. So I mean, it all these things, whether it's urban farming or indoor hydroponics, aquaponics, all these things need to kind of come into play. So it's really a kit of parts as opposed to an either or,
So one of the things that gets mentioned here is the issue of policy and the way academics can influence policy with the work they do. Do you want to talk a bit about that, Andrew? Because you've already touched on it in terms of coming up for recommendations for the L line. So to what extent do you think policymakers are listening to engineers and architects about what we really need for the future of our cities? And or are there ways in which we could do that better?
I think, that experience was perhaps unique because it was effectively a governor decided to sort of bypass the normal operating model of political decision making and go directly to engineering expertise. I think fundamentally, probably more engineers need to seek elected office. I think, frankly, because that's just not the way many countries are run. But I think that would probably yield some more rational thought, because most of what I'm talking about, and Amale also, and this whole discussion is about long range planning and decision making. It's not in short political cycles, and so we're up against some just built-in political challenges, I think, and so it's a real challenge. I'm not a policy expert. I work with people in public policy and government, and engaging with communities because they are voters is a mechanism, but it's these things are still slow, and we do need to move faster.
Okay, in a couple of minutes, I'm just going to ask you a final wrap-up question of one take-home message you'd like to give the audience from today. But before we get to that, Amale, both of you actually, could you tell us a little bit about how you think, we've talked about working with policymakers, but how about engineers working with architects? How well does that go today? Is it something where you think there's a lot of integration and collaboration going on all the time, or do you feel that there's a need to bring this new interdisciplinary way of working more? I mean, you're kind of forced to work together at one level, or another.
We love to work together. What do you mean we're forced to work together?
Okay, you love to work.
I don't know. For me, I think this is a moment, and it has been now for some time, that is all about collaboration, and we can't be experts. In everything, and collaboration is really the key. It allows us to think across scales. It allows us to think to kind of bring together, design used to be here and policy used to be here, and now we have to just bring all these things together, and the only way to do it is to work together. And I don't know, in my experience, every single project, it's just it's just a pleasure to collaborate with our kind of teammates and engineers. So I think we need, as architects, I feel like we need to know more, learn more from our colleagues. That's what I feel, but it's really crucial.
That's why you need a climate school. So there we go. Okay, your one takeaway message for everybody very quickly before we wrap up. Andrew.
I think fundamentally that we should act quickly. So so that we don't fail to slow the rate of change through mitigation, and that we can't keep up with adaptation. I think fundamentally that's my fear. I think there's a way through with technology, but it has to be implemented in a socially responsible way and very thoughtful. And I would say also, sorry, I know this is too long perhaps, but we should think always, whatever we do quickly now, we should do with flexibility in mind. Things change often, and we should build adaptation in for the future.
Amale?
Yes, I think, get engaged, in whatever your discipline or your practice is, or, what is it that in your field you can do to change that field, and to start to kind of push thinking and acting differently forward. And sometimes it's little things every day, and sometimes it's you have an opportunity to have a big impact. But it is a daily, as an architect, it is a daily battle. Like, you are arguing about systems every day. You are arguing about the cost of insulation every day. Like, it's just like, it's relentless. And it's just like every day you're just kind of trying to push the needle. And if we all do that, maybe there's some hope.
Okay, well, I've got to wrap it up. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but I just want to say thank you to both of you, Amale and Andrew, for a fascinating discussion. Thanks everybody else for joining us and for the questions in particular. Climate change, of course, requires new thinking, and as Amale said earlier, transdisciplinary thinking, working together in teams to try and tackle these issues and tackle these systems. So that's the mission of the Climate School, and we really appreciate everybody's involvement in this, and I hope tonight's discussion with Amale and Andrew demonstrates the important work that needs to be done and is going on to address the climate challenge, both from the point of view of mitigation and resilience. We ask that you consider supporting our work by making a gift. Your gifts actually lead directly to new knowledge about our climate system and how to adapt and how to mitigate the terrible effects of climate change going forward. And if you think it isn't so bad right now, I can assure you it's going to be far worse, and it's those younger generations that are going to be most impacted. It's the biggest intergenerational human rights issue we face, and it's going to be far worse in the areas of the world that have been least responsible for the problem, in the tropics and areas like that. So it's really essential that we do this work, and we really appreciate your support as we build the Climate School. When you support the Climate School, you support the future of life on Earth. Thank you very much, and have a safe, healthy few weeks. See you back here again at some point. Thank you. Good evening.
Thank you.